Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we start the round table.
Yes.
Okay, so
And
Luca,
Ryan,
Ryan, Yana.
Yana.
Je suis fatigué.
Fatigué, tu vas quand même nous raconter une histoire.
Okay.
We have enough chairs. Okay, I'm just going to be the humble moderator here. So
Yes, okay.
in a sense, this is the time to pull our chin and see what we have learned, or try to distill what we have learned today, and then we'll ask from the audience some questions or comment, or further question you may have to the panel. So first I'll ask Antoine maybe to kind of summarize the day and the highlights that you see relevant, and then maybe we'll go over to the next members of the panel to give us their 2 or 3 minutes of wisdom, and then we'll open. Is that okay?
Okay, yeah. I think that we have learned a lot from the presentation. So maybe I regret first the absence of Marc Florbet, because we could have put in perspective all these presentations with more precise definitions of what is societal well-being. I also regret that we don't include dynamics, that is to say how the sustainability issue, which is really important, but I think that the theme was very broad. So I have the impression that we have learned a lot. So for example, concerning social justice, I do not know how to summarize what are the main conclusions of this paper. I think that what we can learn from this paper is the fact that globalization is an issue which is multifaceted, and so it's difficult to measure globalizations and to measure the impact of globalizations. Then I would like to also to emphasize the fact that concerning trade and nutrition, I really think that in David's presentations what is important is the fact that trade is not an option. It's a necessary conditions for having a population reaching access to food. I mean, so I think that it was maybe the most important point of his presentations, and of course all the statistics about how countries rely on imports in order to attain food security. Concerning the 2 presentations from this afternoon, so I guess that we had very interesting combinations of theoretical and empirical papers with 2 issues which are really interesting. So how international trade affects the gender gap on the labor markets. So I do not know if there is a pattern in terms, because I have the impression that from the review of literature that Yana exposed, there is a positive effect in rich countries, and there is maybe a presumption of negative effects of the impact of international trade on the gender gap. So is there a pattern here that can be systematic or not? I do not know. And also it was really interesting on the methodological part, and also how to measure the impact of international trade on health by Chang. So with this substantial impact of international trade on health, on these two papers, maybe I am not completely convinced with the way international trade is integrated. So for example, I think that in Yana presentations, this was not an international trade model. This was a model with, in fact, labor considerations, and then more competitions is introduced. And so I do not know exactly how the main characteristic of international trade is tackled by this model. And concerning Shang's presentations also, this is also the questions of, is it the impact of more increased demand on health, or specifically of more exposure to international trade? So this is my remarks.
Okay. Yes, I agree. One kind of theme that seems to be running across some of the presentations is exactly how we think about, the forces associated with trade, and how do you, like in the first presentation, how do you measure globalization? What I'd like to bring in here as the gender person is to think about what are some of the forces at play that we don't always see that affect gender differences. I think Thomas put it well in his fourth point in his discussion just now is, why should we expect to see gender differences? And my neighbor sitting next to me, Brooke, asked, what about children? And especially women carrying the brunt of care work. We haven't talked yet about care work, but I think that would be one reason why we might expect to see mental health differences and depression and stress between men and women differently, is with the burden of care falling disproportionately on women, and women balancing harder work, say from trade, with the care burden. And what else might be some gender differences that we see in some of these other presentations that could cause an unequal playing field between men and women workers. And in my own presentation, it would be, if you buy discrimination, but that's one of these forces that is out there, creates an unlevel playing field. The unequal care burden would be another one. Right after my presentation, I had another discussion, I think it was with Linda, about the different crops that women grow in some sub-Saharan African economies, with women maybe farming more subsistence crops and men farming export, cash-oriented crops. What are some of the traditions leading to those choices, or is that part of the care economy too that affected in that crop choice? So I'd like to think about just bargaining power and why is there an unlevel playing field between men and women, and how could that account for some of these gender differentiated effects? Even in the first discussion, social justice, we talked about how to measure social justice. And one area I think of that is women's economic empowerment, and some of that comes from land ownership, asset ownership, especially land. And if we could think about how that might affect some of these outcomes that we're seeing. So that would be my plug, is to talk a little bit more about what could be explaining these gender differences.
We've got a microphone here, actually. So thank you. A few things. Certainly one of the main focuses of today, from my view, was we've highlighted that trade and globalization matters for reasons more than what we often talk about here, changes in P's and Q's and in bilateral trade flows. And political leaders in trade negotiations typically make claims, well, we will walk away from this agreement if it's not in the best interests of this country, or we will pursue it if it is. And what is in the best interest of a country, as we're learning, is quite fuzzy. To a cynical economist, the best interest of a politician is what is most likely to get them reelected. But even if they present themselves as more progressive or more enlightened than this, it usually just takes the form of either pursuing the commercial interests of exporters or protecting the commercial interests of competing importing firms. And even the after lunch presentation by Robert from the USDA suggested that the ITC is going to do this report on the prospective impacts of TPP. I'm sure that is not going to include things like the effects on depression and workplace injuries and things like that. It's going to be expanded export markets, maybe a little bit on import prices, things like that. But of course, these things are hard to quantify and they're rather fuzzy. And another thing that we economists are actually fairly good at, but we tend not to focus on, I think, because politicians and the press and commentators aren't as interested, is the effects on consumers. It was mentioned a little bit today, and these things are, of course, closely related to P's and Q's and bilateral trade flows. But these effects are almost, at least in my experience, ignored by politicians and by commentators and by the press during trade negotiations. So, the recent case is the agreement or the conclusion of TPP negotiations. In all the press flurry that followed the announcement, there were almost no considerations of the effects on consumers. And these things can be very important, and politicians typically don't address this or sell this as a benefit or perhaps a cost of trade negotiations. And these effects, of course, can be very large, can be larger, and not always good, right? In some cases, for example, in the case that David described regarding Tanzania, they can be negative, right, for food consumers at low income levels in Tanzania. So, certainly we have the tools to measure that, but I find it gets put to the side and not focused on as much as perhaps it should. More specifically, some other things I was trying to think about throughout the presentation was how to relate some of the research today specifically to trade in agriculture and food, because a lot of the research was from industrial settings, manufacturing. And specifically related to Yana's presentation on gender inequality, I was trying to think how would results like this be related to liberalization or globalization in agricultural trade. And of course, it's a big jump. There are a lot of differences. So agricultural production typically is quite competitive, so there would be that consideration. Also, it's not all wage labor. But those are some of the things that I was trying to think about, how these results might translate to liberalization in agricultural trade that we tend to think about quite a bit. So thank you.
Thanks. I'm in an uncomfortable position to be the last speaker of the last session of a long day. So a lot of good things have already been said. I think that it has been a very interesting day, and because it gave me the opportunity to think about a lot of things. So I'll try to put some order in all these thoughts. The first issue is globalization, and it's a complex issue. I think that the first presentation made it clear that you have many different dimensions. I still think that around this room and in most presentations we have in mind trade in goods, but I think that globalization is much more than that, and most of the most interesting and most dramatic action nowadays is taking place in other dimensions. For example, movement of factors of production and especially movement of people, and I think this thing should draw much more attention from our profession in the future. Then from globalization and all the problem of measurement of this kind of complex variable, you have the point, what is globalization? It's an instrument or it's an end in itself? Well, if it's an end in itself, you have a sort of a value judgment. It could be either good or bad for some kind of ethical, moral, political reason. But in this case, it's not our business as economists because it's an end, so we can just discuss it over a beer if it's good or bad, but not much to be said analytically. If it's an instrument, it's more interesting because then there is a kind of a consequentialist point of view, and then we can try to draw the implication about the impact of this instrument. And there is this very interesting, from our point of view, methodological debate about causality, reverse causality, endogeneity. I think in this respect that the most important point is that usually there is a lot of attention from ourselves on the modeling of the policy shock, for example trade policy. I think that there should be more attention about the modeling of the baseline. In a sense, in this kind of policy debate that I've been involved with, it strikes me that often people that are against trade liberalization have in mind a sort of a golden age. something like, in some recent Italian debate, the good old days when the Italian firms were producing nice t-shirts and selling them over the world, and then the naughty Chinese came with their cheap t-shirt and swipe away all our industry. So the basic idea in these people is that if there weren't for the Chinese, if there weren't for the WTO, today we could be still selling t-shirts. And this is probably false. No? It's not the right counterfactual and baseline that you want to use to make the comparison. So I think that in this case we should do a lot of good work. Then you have the effects of the social well-being. This is another multidimensional concept with a lot of different implications, and the effects could be good or bad. And what is good or bad is a moot point. No? If you were in Paris last week, for example, I think that a lot of people thought that economic growth in GDP, in production, emission, pollution, is not a good thing. So, in this respect, of course, things could be quite simple if you have just a simple bad or good effect, if you agree if what is bad or good. But things get even more complicated because sometimes good and bad effects takes place together. So even if you consider economic growth a good thing, then you have pollution. This implies that then you have to consider cost and benefit. You have to consider general equilibrium effects. Some people could have a lower wage, but then could have cheaper goods to buy. You can have higher employment, but then more pollution. So basically, the result is that you want to look at the net balance or some kind of ratio, but at the end of the day, again, if you get something negative, then you want to stop globalization, liberalization, to throw some sand in the treadmill, or you want to support it. Not for sure. Even if you get something like a positive result in your cost-benefit analysis, this is a sort of a necessary but not sufficient condition. Because you could argue that you could get the same benefit with some possible alternative. There is always a possible benchmark or cost opportunity to consider. No? For example, today David was mentioning, what if we would achieve the same level of food security without trade? Or you could say, what if we would achieve the same level of growth without trade, with an autarkic approach? I think that this is what is relevant in terms of our counterfactual. And this comes also when we present some of the results. For example, we get some kind of a cost, okay, or benefit. We should be, as applied economists, careful to measure that, take into account both cost and benefit. But even when we present the cost, what is the right measure of the cost? Of course, it was true, it was a very good paper in terms of empirical assessment of the cost in terms of illness and from the social point of view. But this is the total cost. What would be the difference if this type of increased demand would have been domestic rather than foreign? This would be, to me, the real difference in terms of globalization or alternatives. It's a counterfactual, it's very difficult, but it's an interesting point. Let me just conclude with an example to make clear, because I think it's important. We have some kind of death toll in terms of car accident. No? This is the cost of mobility. Of course, this is something that is real. This is due to the fact that people use car. But then, if you think that you want to achieve some kind of mobility, and then you have two different alternatives, I don't know, car or metro or public bus, then you would have some accident also in the other alternative, and then if you compare the two, it's the difference, it's the delta between these two options that it's the real additional cost of this type of option. And just to conclude with this kind of issue in terms of climate change, sometimes strikes me that people blame pollution on international trade liberalization. Okay, this is due to the fact that in some cases, hopefully you get some growth out of globalization. But then in that case, the true benchmark, the alternative would be, what if the same growth would have been achieved without trade liberalization? You want to have a ceteris paribus condition, because otherwise what will you blame or you praise for liberalization, it's a bit too much. But thanks again to all the speakers and discussants, because this was a very thoughtful session. Thanks.
Okay, we can open to a discussion. Yes, try. Go ahead. Oh, you want a microphone? Sorry. It's coming.
Thank you very much. Those are great points. I would just like to make 2 points, selfishly related to our paper. The first one is you guys are really interested in knowing what is the difference between trade versus domestic demand shocks. I mean, that's a great question, and that's surely a question we can look at in future research. But the state of the literature is as follows. We do not know how domestic demand shocks affect health. Neither do we know how international trade affects health. And we are taking that first step. Should we take the next step? Absolutely, and that's what we are hoping to achieve. Going back to your example about cars, what we are showing is, by the way, cars do cause traffic accidents. That's what we are showing, which is not what we know from the existing literature. And that's how we think about our contribution. And the second point I would like to make is related to the first one. Is our paper a trade paper, or is our paper some, other areas like labor or health? I mean, we all have our own sort of areas, right? We do food, we do agriculture, we do labor, we do gender inequality, we do trade. But we are all economists, right, at the end of the day. And so I think as a field, whether it's agriculture or trade or some other area, we would like to make sure that other economists value our work and we make a contribution to other areas of economics as well. So why should macroeconomists, why should labor economists, why should public economists care about what we do in this room or in our field? And from this perspective, I believe that our paper is an area of strength. What we are saying to all economists is as follows. Why should you care about trade? Because trade offers an exogenous shock that you can identify in the data and use as an identification tool in your empirical work. So we are trying to make our work relevant not just to people in the area, but also people in other areas of economics as well. And I think that's what, to some extent, the other speakers are also trying to do, right? Not just about trade, not just about P and Q, but also about some other stuff, right? Related to the other areas in economics. So, thank you.
Okay, other comments or questions? Or, yes, Tim? Tim?
Yeah, I just had a brief comment which might turn into a question as well. And that is, well, it seems to me there's always two separate issues when we talk about trade. One is the existence of trade, and the other is changes in trade. And a lot of what I've heard today has been sort of, what happens if there's an expansion of trade. It seems to me that many cases when you're thinking about trade, you can ask the question in the other way. What happens if there's a reduction in trade, if there's a contraction? And unfortunately, that's not a totally unrealistic hypothesis. There are many cases where trade has been reduced, and at the moment we're thinking, trade agreements. We've got these trade agreements, TPP, TTIP, and so on, and possibly something in the WTO, and everything's going forward. But it's not immediately clear to me that we're actually in a sort of situation where everything has to go forward, as we've seen from the Chinese economy as it not collapses, but as it stops growing so fast, that has some very negative effects on other countries. So I just wanted to see if the panel had any views as to whether their results in terms of trade are apply to the negative as well as the positive actions of trade. I mean, in other words, if trade collapses, what's the gender equity implication of that, or the health implication of that? Thanks.
Okay, maybe, yes? We.
Well, today's theme of looking at trade and various social issues here is consistent with the more movement generally in economics of moving away from traditional but narrow measures of welfare and economic effects. For example, in macroeconomics, there's at least pressures or arguments to move away from simply using GDP or growth as a measure of a country's social and economic status. In trade, of course, we have a very standard way of looking at the welfare effects, using the concepts of producer-consumer surplus, plus the effects on government expenditure. That approach is very narrow. It misses a lot, but it has the great benefits that you can end up with a single measured in terms of dollars and cents, which is a net measure. You get a positive, net positive or negative effects, and you can also look at the trade-offs between at least producers, consumers, and the government. Now, just because that and other approaches are simple doesn't mean you just confine yourselves to those approaches. But as we move on to these richer areas here of issues to examine, you have the challenges that if you don't have a common unit of measurement of welfare effects, and the only one I can imagine is some monetary measure, then from a policy point of view, how do you prioritize? Which of these should receive higher priority as an economic goal, and how do you assess trade-offs between these competing goals, which is a challenge of policymakers. So here's just a question to the panel, anybody, is, to what extent is it important to try to find a common unit of measurement of the welfare effects for all these different social issues, and is that really feasible?
Okay, Willie, you had a comment?
Yes, since Tim mentioned trade contraction, I just thought of one recently, the Russian import ban, which we have now an experiment underway, and we're having a session Tuesday morning about that, but that's kind of a plug for that. But we do have an opportunity to study the effects of that now that this has happened already, and we can see some of the consequences, not for sure for how long, but anyway, it's a case that we could look at.
Okay, maybe the panel wants to address these three, or the two big comments. The one on trade contractions and the point of, in a sense, coming up with some kind of metric on to measure the social consequences.
I think I could speak a little bit to and then Luca, to the literature that I've seen on the trade contraction, which is a great question. And some of that is starting to get published now after the 2007, 8, 9, the almost triple crisis, global financial crisis. There was a food price crisis and another crisis that hit some countries triply hard. And I think some of the findings there were not so much in terms of gender wage gaps, but looking at employment effects, where with again looking at what are some of the unseen gender forces. The male breadwinner model is often, when there were job losses, women tended to lose their jobs more than men because of the male breadwinner model, this view that men were more entitled to the jobs because they were supporting families. So women disproportionately lost jobs in response to the global financial crisis, which for many countries also included demand shocks with trade. And the other thing we haven't really talked much about is children, and I'm doing some work right now in India and child labor, and something that we saw in 2008 in the data was a huge spike in child labor, especially those children whose parents worked in the mining industry, and that was where India was especially hard hit with the global contraction, was in gem exports and other mining exports. And it seemed to have really, in terms of consumption smoothing on households, poor households, we saw a big spike in child labor in India. So that's something else to think about in terms of societal well-being, is how sometimes children are used, child labor is used for consumption smoothing, and how that might come into play with a contraction in trade and in demand, global demand.
That's good.
Can I say something about the metric issue?
Yeah.
That's an excellent question. Should we have a common metric? Absolutely. Is that feasible? Yes. It's about a paper. So we do have a framework that converts the higher rates of injury and multiple types of sickness into a dollar value and compare that with wage gains from trade. You can easily extend that framework to other types of diseases. But if you look at the other things to include the other dimensions, that's not our framework. So if you ask, how about health? The answer is yes. If you ask, how about the other dimensions? I wouldn't know. So.
Yes, Luca?
Just a comment about the working? Yes. But the negative shocks, I think that perhaps could have been even worse. Perhaps it would be worse. And the comment by Tim suggested to me that in a period where a lot of people is disappointed by the performance of the WTO in terms of the closure of the door around, I think that perhaps it shouldn't be forgotten that the WTO is useful not only for what could achieve in terms of further liberalization, but what it helps to maintain in terms of already achieved liberalization. And I think that from that point of view, the existence of a multilateral framework avoided that in a time of economic recession there was a big increase in trade measure as it happened in other recession in the past. So I think that this is interesting. In terms of aggregating different dimension, I would say that you have two possible, in principle, approach. One is the statistical approach, let's call it like that, that we saw this morning in terms of aggregating different things using principal components or some kind of weights coming from some kind of statistical procedure, or you can have some kind of economics-based approach like the one that was suggested by Chongxiang in the paper to find a money metric for the effect. And I think that the second one, to me, it's more consistent with our economic framework. So I would suggest that if you need to aggregate different dimensions, even if it's difficult, money metric is the common currency that we could try to pursue.
So I have a sub-question to Yana. Are there attempts to put dollar signs on gender inequalities? I presume some people must have attempted to do that.
To put a dollar sign on
yeah,
gender
some kind
inequality?
of valuation on the cost of inequality.
At the macro level, I think the main attempts have been looking at the impact on economic growth and what is the extra contribution in terms of GDP per capita to reducing gender inequality. And Stefan Claassen has done some of that work. I think Nicholas cited work by Stefan Claassen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. More comments or questions? Or?
Oh, and actually, the work that I mentioned in a comment earlier on LGBT rights and inclusiveness, there was a dollar figure. That's work I'm doing with Lee Badgett. And I think we came up with, on a scale of 1 to 8, this index of legal rights for LGBT individuals. If a country has one additional legal right, it increases GDP per capita by about $300.
Okay.
So that's in the case of LGBT rights.
Okay. So we can put dollar signs on that.
Yes.
Okay, sounds good. Alan, you wanted to intervene?
Yeah, Alan Matthews. I just wanted to congratulate Antoine and those of you involved in choosing the topic of trade and societal well-being, because I think it does reflect the fact that the questions and the debates around trade in society have become much broader than if you like, traditionally. Robin talked about the difficulties of communicating economic ideas to lawyers, but I think that's the least of our communication problems in a sense. I mean, there are many constituencies out there now in the discussion on the public health community and trade and nutrition with David. I mean, David sort of threw his hands up and said, look, it's impossible to talk with these people. But in fact, it seems to me that well, my question, if I can, is to ask the panel to comment on this question of communicating with these groups who have very non-traditional concerns about trade. I mean, the traditional concern clearly has always been in terms of import competition, loss of jobs, lower quality jobs. Andy Schmitz this morning reminded us that the gains from trade were always in net terms, and we have good explanations as to why those who lose from trade tend to, politically voice their concerns more effectively than those who gain from trade. But now we have consumer concerns. I mean, the debate in Europe about TTIP is not so much about the producer impacts, but it's very much the consumer impacts, the fear that somehow trade rules are going to encourage a regulatory race to the bottom, a regulatory chill, and so on. So you have a new constituency, if you like, that is now questioning the benefits of trade. And then you have another group, traditionally quite positive towards trade, those with an interest in development and developing issues, who now, at least in Europe, begin to turn around and see trade as a way of us exploiting and taking unfair advantage of resources in developing countries. So the whole idea of ecological footprints, how much is the land, does the average European consumer use of land outside Europe? And this is sort of a form of land grabbing, and it's a form of, we're taking food out of the mouths of people in developing countries because we're importing that food for our animals in the form of soybeans or whatever. I mean, there are very traditional economic answers to these issues, but somehow these debates we don't seem to communicate very well. So it's that issue of communication and how do we engage, or should we be engaging with these constituencies which politically are becoming more and more important. And I think Rob's graph in terms of the increasing difficulty there is in terms of getting support for trade agreements is a reflection of some of these issues.
Yes, one more comment. Yeah, good question.
Ann Eflin, USDA. I just want to say in connection with what Alan just said, I think Luca's point about paying attention to the baseline is key to this communication, because what you need to do is make clear what the real choices are, not nostalgic choices or sort of straw choices of what might be the ideal preferred of some particular group. So when things can be put in a perspective that makes a real political choice or a real social choice, then people know what they're choosing. And that's the reality that people need in front of them to start thinking clearly about these issues, as opposed to imagining some other reality that might exist if we could get rid of the bad stuff.
Okay, maybe we can ask the panel their wisdom about the communication.
Honestly, I'm very pessimistic about communication, so I think the battle is almost lost. In fact, I invest a lot of my time in communications. For example, I'm trying to write many blogs about what could be the impact of trade agreements and so on. So for example, 3 months ago, I made in France communications about transatlantic pacts and the impacts. And so I've never seen so many people in a room for one of my communications, but they were completely strongly opposed to what I was trying to explain. And they were very violent. I mean, so, and I think that we can try to explain what is counterfactual analysis and what is the baseline and what could be, but it's really difficult. So I'm very pessimistic, but I mean that this is becoming ideological, most of the debate, and the policymakers are following this trend. And so, for example, in France, I take the case of France, but I think that there are other countries like US which are showing this kind of evolutions. But in France, right now, all the main candidates to the presidential elections are opposed to globalization. And so this is what they put in their programs. While 10 years ago, we have people from the center right, which were who announced in their program that they support globalizations, but now it's over. So, I mean, and I think that it's exactly the same thing in Poland, in Hungary, and in other countries in Europe, and so I'm very pessimistic about it.
Maybe I'll just follow up on that. I maybe not quite as pessimistic. I do some communication extension work with some NGOs. I mentioned the Food Grains Bank, that's one group, and they are sort of inherently confrontational on issues like this. They come from a very different world, and economists, one staff member there who told me in confidence that in a meeting there, the economists were described as, quote, the devil. So, you face that large obstacle just walking into the room. I have had a little bit of success in trying to describe them what economists actually do, and what we've just said in that what we're trying to do is build a counterfactual, right? Control for things and describe that, this is what the world, we're controlling for all these things, this is the effect of what we're trying to measure. So, I don't have starry-eyed visions of being able to convince all these people, but I'm perhaps a little bit less pessimistic because I've had a little bit of personal success marginally, but I think it's a huge obstacle, and the weight on lobbying on these groups versus other groups is very much dependent on the issue. In development policy, at least in Canada, I think that voice is less strong, but perhaps in some of the trade policy areas, some of the protectionist voices are stronger. So I think it depends what group you're trying to talk to. If you're talking to consumers or NGOs, I think the strategies need to be different.
Yes, just two points. The first one, I think that in terms of what Anna was mentioning, there is something different in this environment with respect to the past. I think that protection, traditional trade policy were about protection, and the normative implication were about eliminating, reducing these policies, and this was one frame. In terms of non-tariff barriers, new policies, it's not only about protection. There is some protection, but there is a lot of precaution. It's a lot about consumer safety, this type of concern. So in this case, the framework is not about reduction, elimination, tariff cutting formulas. It's about harmonization, it's about mutual recognition, it's about implementation, coordination. So I think that in this respect, our tools and our mindsetting should be a bit different in the future. In terms of communication, I don't have many happy stories to tell, but to make the point, what is the major contribution of economists, of economics, I think is the budget constraint. It's the concept of opportunity cost. Let me be blunt at this hour of the day. I think that with our models, we can get any possible results from 0 to infinite. You just change the relative prices, you can get that it's optimal to have autarky or free trade. So in this sense, it's value neutral. What is good in this type of modeling framework of economics is that it makes clear what are the costs of different choices. And I think that what people don't like in economics and in the economies is that it makes clear this point. While if you talk without a framework, you can say how good would be to keep these trees, how good would be to keep this child out of the factory in the school. So you can have all your dreaming scenarios, but you have no reality check, because everything seems to be a free lunch, everything seems to be possible, and who would be against that? No? So I think that what is our value in the debate is not to support a specific agenda, but just to make clear, okay, this is what you want, this is the cost. Then if we want to go for it, we can decide to do that as a society.
Okay. Thank you. It was a long day and productive, and I hope you all go home with some things to think about, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow morning. Okay, bye-bye.